There's a truly fascinating phenomenon you notice when you spend any time looking at old maps.
Oh, yeah. Like the really old cartographic ones.
Yeah, exactly. Like from the 15th or 16th century, you pull them up and you see these beautifully illustrated land masses, right? Incredibly detailed coastlines where the map maker actually knew the geography.
Right, they had the shipping routes down perfectly.
Yeah. But then right in the middle of a massive continent or, way out in the uncharted waters of the ocean, the cartographer has just drawn a sea monster.
Right, or they've scribbled the classic phrase, here be dragons.
Exactly. Here be dragons. And it is just the ultimate visual representation of human ignorance facing the unknown. Because, well, the human mind just abhors a vacuum.
It really does.
Mm-hmm.
When we look at a terrifying uncharted void, we feel this overwhelming psychological need to fill it with something tangible, even if that something is entirely mythical.
Yeah, we look back and laugh at those old maps today. I mean, we have satellite imagery, we have GPS right in our pockets, and we assume we have mapped out all the dragons, right?
We like to think so, yeah.
Yeah.
We consider ourselves highly rational.
Right. But consider this terrifying question. What happens when an entire society, and, not just any society, but the most advanced, educated, philosophically sophisticated civilization of its era, draws a mental map of a distant land, fills it with absolute fantasies of infinite wealth, and then just wagers its entire existence on that collective illusion?
Well, when a society does that, the result is usually one of the most spectacular, devastating, and thoroughly documented collapses in human history.
Which is exactly what we are getting into today. Welcome to the Deep Dive, everyone. Today we are jumping into a really heavy stack of research. Our primary source is a fascinating, multidisciplinary analysis of books 6 and 7 of Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War.
Yeah, we are going way back to Athens in the years 415 to 413 BC.
Right. This is the story of the Sicilian expedition. It was a massive, catastrophic military campaign launched by the Athenian democracy to conquer the distant island of Sicily.
And Thucydides gives us this harrowing, surgically precise account of the disaster. I mean, he was an Athenian himself. He had served as a general.
So he knew what he was talking about.
Exactly. And he documents this incredible tragedy, not just as a sequence of battles. It's a study of clashing egos, staggering political hubris, and this profound, almost willful ignorance of reality.
Now, I want to be really clear about our objective for this deep dive today, because the source material we are unpacking does something incredibly unique. It doesn't just offer a dry recount of ancient troop movements.
No, not at all. It dives deeply into the mechanics of the history, sure, but it also explores a fascinating linguistic analysis of the ancient Greek text to show us how Thucydides manipulated the reader's emotion.
Yeah, the linguistics part blew my mind. But then the source makes this massive, profound pivot. The author actually argues that analyzing this ancient pagan military catastrophe can serve a deeply spiritual purpose.
Right. The premise here is that Thucydides' account holds up a mirror to universal human sinfulness.
Exactly. By looking at the absolute futility of worldly empire building in ancient Athens, the source suggests we are looking at a diagnosis of the human condition.
Yeah, it's a critique of worldly power.
Right. And our ultimate mission today is to use this secular tragedy to actually deepen your Christian faith, to inspire a greater love for Christ, and equip you to navigate the power dynamics of your own daily life with gospel humility.
It's a big goal.
It is. So, okay, let's unpack this. To understand the sheer magnitude of the crash, we first have to understand the staggering height from which Athens fell. We need to build out the world of 415 BC.
Right. So the broader Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta has been raging for years at this point. But at this specific moment, they are in a sort of holding pattern.
We're taking a breather.
Yeah, they are living under a very fragile, uneasy truce known as the Peace of Nicias. And to understand the Athenian mindset in 415 BC, you really have to understand the trauma they had just endured.
The plague. Right.
Exactly. Athens is arguably the greatest naval superpower the Mediterranean has ever seen. But they are a deeply scarred superpower. Just a few years prior, while crammed behind their city walls to avoid Spartan armies, this devastating plague swept through the city.
And it was bad. I mean, really bad.
It wiped out an estimated 1/4 to 1/3 of their entire population.
Wow. That is just, I can't even fathom that level of loss in such a concentrated area. And it wasn't just the sheer number of the dead either. It was who they lost.
Right. The plague killed Pericles. He was their most brilliant statesman, their guiding voice.
So the psychological toll of that kind of mass casualty event is just off the charts. You have a populace dealing with severe survivor's guilt, economic disruption, and this desperate, burning desire to prove that their golden age wasn't over.
Yeah, they are eager to reassert their dominance. They need a win. So in this tense environment of a Cold War with Sparta, a delegation arrives from Sicily.
Specifically diplomats from a city called Segesta, right? And refugees from a city called Leontini.
Yes. They come to the Athenian assembly begging for military assistance. They are locked in a regional border dispute with their neighbors, and the most dangerous of those neighbors is Syracuse.
Okay, we need to talk about Syracuse because they are not some insignificant backwater town that Athens can just swat away.
Not at all. Syracuse is a massive, wealthy, incredibly powerful Dorian colony. Culturally and politically, you can think of Syracuse as the Sparta of the West. They are formidable.
Okay, so put yourself in the shoes of an Athenian citizen at this moment. You are recovering from a plague. You finally have peace with Sparta after a brutal decade of war. Your treasury is finally starting to replenish.
Right.
The logical, rational response to a request for help from a distant island would be, highly measured. You might send a few diplomats to mediate.
Or maybe, if you absolutely had to show force, you send a dozen ships as a token gesture, just to honor the alliance.
Exactly. Instead, the Athenian assembly votes to launch an armada of incomprehensible scale.
The numbers are staggering. The initial launch includes roughly 134 triremes.
And for you listening, a trireme isn't a simple wooden rowboat. It is the absolute pinnacle of ancient military technology. It's a sleek, incredibly fast warship powered by 170 rowers.
Yeah, armed with a heavy bronze ram at the front, designed to just smash enemy vessels to splinters. And maintaining just one of these ships is astonishingly expensive.
But Athens sends 134 of them, alongside support vessels carrying over 5,000 heavily armed hoplite infantrymen, plus thousands of light troops, archers, and crew.
It represents a massive percentage of their total military and financial capital. They're going all in.
And the detail in our source document that just blew my mind is the foundation of profound ignorance beneath this massive armada. I mean, Thucydides goes out of his way to explicitly emphasize that when the Athenians were voting to launch this fleet, the vast majority of them had absolutely no concept of how massive the island of Sicily actually was.
No, they didn't. They didn't understand that you could fit the entire Peloponnese inside it. They didn't understand the complex web of political alliances between the Sicilian city-states.
They lacked even the most basic intelligence gathering. The Segestan diplomats stood in front of the Athenian assembly and promised that they possessed vast treasuries of silver and gold, enough to entirely fund the Athenian expedition.
And the Athenians simply took their word for it. They actually sent a small scouting party who were easily duped.
This part is so crazy to me. Tell them about the bowls.
Oh, it's wild. The Segestans literally passed the same set of silver bowls from house to house during banquets to make it look to the Athenian scouts like everyone in the city was immensely wealthy.
And Athens bought the illusion hook, line, and sinker. It just reminds me of a heavyweight boxer who has just gone through a brutal string of fights. He took a terrible beating, maybe suffered a career-threatening injury.
Right, that's Athens surviving the plague.
Yeah. And he finally gets a moment of rest and recovery. But out of sheer, unadulterated ego, out of a desperate, gnawing need to prove to the world and to himself that he is still the undisputed champion, he accepts a bout in a totally unfamiliar weight class.
Yeah, he signs a contract to fight an opponent he knows nothing about.
Exactly, without ever bothering to watch the opponent's tape, entirely based on a promoter's lie that the purse will be the biggest in history.
That analogy captures the psychology perfectly. It is a collective societal blindness. The alluring fantasy of expanding their empire and acquiring infinite wealth completely short-circuited their critical thinking.
They wanted it to be true so badly.
They did. They wanted the Segestan wealth to be real, and they wanted the conquest of Sicily to be easy, so they collectively decided that it was true.
But wait, I have to ask a mechanical question here. Athens wasn't a dictatorship where one unhinged king made a unilateral decision. They were a radical democracy.
Right, arguably the most direct democracy in history.
So how did an entire voting populace, thousands of people, get swept up in such a poorly researched idea? You'd think at least one person in the crowd would raise their hand and say, can we see the actual accounting ledgers from Segesta before we mortgage the entire navy?
Well, someone did try to warn them. But to understand how the democracy bypassed logic and marched willingly into disaster, we have to examine the men who were standing at the podium.
Right. the leaders.
Thucydides uses this moment to lay bare the inherent vulnerabilities of a direct democracy. This wasn't just a failure of information. It was a profound failure of leadership.
A terrifying example of how charismatic rhetoric can completely overwhelm rational policy.
Exactly. Our source document spends a lot of time analyzing the generals the assembly appointed to lead this expedition, specifically Nicias, Alcibiades, and Lamachus.
And the way Thucydides structures this narrative is brilliant. The source actually describes books 6 and 7 as functioning like a play within a play. It doesn't read like a dry military logbook.
No, it has a perfect, agonizing, tragic arc. Thucydides was deeply influenced by the Greek tragic playwrights of his era, like Sophocles.
So he gives us a prologue, right?
Right. He gives us a prologue that carefully explains the true history and massive scale of Sicily, ensuring the reader knows exactly what the Athenians don't.
Setting up the dramatic irony.
Yes. Then he moves us into the assembly for these grand, sweeping, rhetorical debates. From there, we witness the majestic, almost arrogant departure of the fleet. And finally, the slow, excruciating reversal of fortune that ends in utter annihilation.
Okay, let's look at the grand debate. At the very center are two men who could not be more different. Nicias and Alcibiades. They are the ultimate political odd couple.
They really are. Let's start with Nicias. He represents extreme caution. He is an older, highly respected, incredibly wealthy conservative statesman.
He's the guy trying to stop the madness.
Exactly. He is standing in the assembly, desperately trying to throw water on the fire. He is telling the people, do not do this. We are stretching our empire too thin. We just got out of a war with Sparta. Sicily is too far away.
He's the voice of pragmatic, cold reality.
Yes, but he is matched against Alcibiades. And Alcibiades is essentially a political rock star.
Yeah, Alcibiades is fascinating. He's young, spectacularly wealthy, incredibly handsome, and terrifyingly charismatic. He had been a ward of Pericles, a student of Socrates.
And he was known for his flamboyant lifestyle. I mean, he entered 7 chariots in the Olympic Games just to show off his wealth.
7 chariots, just a massive flex. And his ambition was absolutely unchecked.
So Alcibiades takes the podium and tells the assembly exactly what they want to hear. He argues that the Athenian Empire is basically like a shark. If it stops swimming forward, if it starts expanding, it will die.
He pitches preemptive conquest as the only way to maintain security.
And he masterfully manipulates the psychology of the crowd. Thucydides uses a very specific Greek word to describe what comes over the Athenian assembly: eros.
Eros. Now, we usually associate eros with romantic or sexual love, right?
Right, but in this context, it means a deep, passionate, almost irrational lust for conquest and acquisition. Alcibiades feeds that eros. He paints a picture of eternal glory and endless riches.
And Nicias realizes he is losing the debate. So he tries a really risky rhetorical maneuver. He stands back up and uses reverse psychology.
A classic political bluff.
Yeah. He says, fine, if you insist on going to Sicily, the small fleet we discussed isn't going to cut it. You will need a massive armada. You will need thousands of hoplites, countless support ships, and an astronomical amount of money. It will cost us everything.
Nicias thinks this staggering price tag will shock the assembly back to their senses.
But the strategy completely backfires.
Completely. Instead of being deterred by the cost, the assembly is intoxicated by the sheer scale of the vision. They essentially say, you're right, Nicias, that sounds incredible. We will vote you all the money and ships you need.
And to make matters worse, they appoint Nicias to co-command the expedition alongside Alcibiades and the veteran soldier Lamachus.
They force the man who fundamentally believes the mission is doomed to lead it alongside the man who recklessly dreamed it up. It's a recipe for disaster.
And the source highlights the devastating irony of the fleet's departure. Thucydides describes the scene at the Piraeus harbor. Almost the entire population of Athens comes down to the docks.
The triremes are literally racing each other to show off. The soldiers have polished their armor to a blinding shine. Officers are using solid gold and silver cups to pour wine libations into the sea, praying to the gods for victory.
It is a spectacle of unrivaled splendor.
But Thucydides writes it in such a way that the splendor itself feels suffocating. Every glittering shield, every golden cup, every cheer from the crowd is dripping with tragic irony, because the reader already knows they are sailing into a wood chipper.
It is the ultimate manifestation of pride before the fall. And before the fleet even clears the Greek coastline, everything starts to unravel, triggered by one of the most bizarre religious scandals in ancient history.
Oh, the mutilation of the Herms.
Yes. To understand the panic this caused, you have to understand Athenian street-level religion. Scattered all throughout the city of Athens, in front of doorways, temples, and in the public square, were thousands of stone statues called urns.
Right. They were squared stone pillars topped with the carved head of the god Hermes and featuring male genitalia at the base. They were ancient symbols of protection, boundaries, and good fortune for travelers.
Okay, so one morning, right before the fleet is scheduled to launch, the citizens of Athens wake up and step out of their houses to discover an absolute nightmare.
Right. During the night, organized bands of vandals had swept through the city and systematically smashed the faces and genitals off almost every single herm in Athens.
Just mass vandalism. But the psychological impact on the city was akin to a massive terrorist attack. The Athenians didn't just view this as kids playing a prank. They viewed it as a horrific, calculated sacrilege.
They believed that whoever did this was intentionally stripping the city of its divine protection right as they were about to launch the largest military operation in their history. It was the worst possible omen.
The populace descended into absolute paranoia. And the political enemies of Alcibiades sense an opportunity here.
They certainly do. They fan the flames of the panic and start circulating rumors that Alcibiades and his wealthy aristocratic drinking buddies were the ones who mutilated the statues.
They accuse him of plotting to overthrow the democracy and install himself as a tyrant.
Now, the assembly allows the fleet to launch because they don't want to delay the expedition. But shortly after the armada arrives in Sicily, an official state ship arrives from Athens with a terrifying order for Alcibiades.
He is recalled to stand trial for his life on charges of sacrilege and treason.
And this is where Alcibiades proves that his only true loyalty was always to himself.
Wait, so he doesn't go back for the trial?
No, he agrees to follow the state ship back to Athens, but during the journey, he just slips away in the night. He defects.
He abandons Athens entirely.
Yes, and he sails straight to Sparta, the bitter, mortal enemy of his own people. And he doesn't just ask for asylum. He immediately begins advising the Spartan high command on exactly how to dismantle the Athenian expedition he just helped plan.
It is a breathtaking betrayal. He tells the Spartans, if you want to break Athens, you must send a Spartan general to Sicily immediately to organize the defense of Syracuse, and you must fortify a permanent garrison in Athenian territory to choke them economically.
And the Spartans listen to him. Meanwhile, back in Sicily, the massive Athenian armada is now effectively under the command of Nicias.
A man who is chronically ill, hyper-cautious, and fundamentally believes the expedition is a mistake.
Right, and the source outlines the horrific sequence of events that follows. Lanicus, the only truly experienced aggressive tactician among the generals, is killed in a minor skirmish early in the campaign.
So Nicias is left totally alone to run the siege of Syracuse, and he hesitates, he builds walls slowly, he fails to close the naval blockade.
This gives the Syracusans time to breathe. But more importantly, it gives time for the Spartan general Gylippus to arrive.
And the arrival of Gylippus is the turning point, isn't it?
Absolutely. He is a brilliant, aggressive commander. He completely reorganizes the Syracusan defense, builds counter walls to block the Athenians, and literally turns the besiegers into the besieged.
The massive Athenian army finds itself bogged down in the malarial swamps outside the city walls. Sickness starts tearing through their camp.
And the climax of the disaster takes place in the great harbor of Syracuse. The Athenians try to break out using their navy, but the harbor is a confined, tight space.
Right, and the Athenian triremes relied on speed, open water, and complex maneuvering to ram enemy ships.
Exactly. In the claustrophobic confines of the great harbor, they can't maneuver. The Syracusans heavily reinforce the prows of their own ships and just crash into the Athenians head-on.
The water turns to absolute chaos. Ships are locked together, infantry fighting across the decks. The pride of the Athenian navy is completely shattered.
Left with no fleet, the remaining Athenian army, tens of thousands of men, has no choice but to abandon their dead and their sick and attempt a desperate overland retreat into the Sicilian interior.
They're just hoping to find a friendly allied city. But here's where it gets really interesting, and I want to push back on a common narrative here based on what our source points out.
Okay, what's that?
Often, Nicias is portrayed as the tragic, reasonable figure in this story. You know, the guy who was right all along, but was ignored by the foolish mob. But looking at the details of the retreat, didn't Nicias' own paralyzing caution and extreme superstition doom the retreating army just as much as Alcibiades' initial ambition?
That is a phenomenal point, and it actually strikes at the core of Thucydides' critique of human leadership. Thucydides is deeply interested in the failures of human agency at both extreme ends of the spectrum.
Right, reckless ambition versus crippling fear.
Yes. Before the final naval battle, when things were looking grim but retreat was still entirely possible, the Athenian commanders secretly agreed to quietly pack up the army and sail away in the night.
A tactical retreat.
Right. But on the exact night they planned to leave, there was a lunar eclipse.
Just a completely natural astronomical event.
Yes, but to Nicias, it was a terrifying divine omen. He consulted his soothsayers, and they told him the army could not move for thrice 9 days, 27 days.
Oh, wow. 27 days in hostile territory.
And Nicias, paralyzed by religious superstition and a deep-seated fear of making a wrong move, ordered the entire army to stand still.
That delay gave the Syracusans the time they needed to block the harbor exit and trap them permanently. So the mob chose a leader driven by pure, selfish ambition, and then they left the execution of the war to a leader driven by crippling fear.
Exactly. Neither extreme possessed the actual wisdom, prudence, or virtue required to govern or lead a civilization in crisis.
And the end result of Nicias' delay is one of the most horrific scenes in ancient literature. The retreating army is harassed by Syracusan cavalry for days. They are dying of thirst.
Finally, they reach the Asneris River. And the men are so mad with thirst that they break ranks and rush into the water, just trampling each other.
And the Syracusans just stand on the high banks and slaughter them as they drink the muddy, blood-stained water.
The survivors are herded into the deep stone quarries of Syracuse, left exposed to the baking sun and freezing nights, slowly starving to death among the rotting corpses of their friends. Tens of thousands of men, an entire generation of Athenian power, simply erased from the earth.
It is a devastating narrative, but what truly elevates our source document is how it analyzes how Thucydides tells the story. He doesn't just list these grim facts.
No, he engineers the Greek text to make the reader psychologically experience the collapse. This moves us into the systemic functional linguistics, or SFL, analysis provided by the source.
Right. Now, linguistic analysis might sound a little dry to some people, but it is actually the key to unlocking the emotional power of the text.
It really is. The source relies heavily on an SFL approach, specifically drawing on the methodology of a scholar named Constantine Campbell regarding Greek verbal aspect.
Okay, to understand this, we have to look at how ancient Greek verbs function, right? Which is fundamentally different from English. Let's break that down. When we think of verbs in English, we mostly think of time, past, present, future. I walked, I'm walking, I will walk.
Right?
How is Greek verbal aspect different, and how does Thucydides use it as a tool of manipulation?
Well, in ancient Greek, the choice of a verb tense certainly involves time, but more importantly, it conveys the author's subjective perspective on the action. It is about how the author wants you, the reader, to view the event.
So it's about proximity and distance.
Exactly. The source focuses on how Thucydides masterfully toggles between different aspects to control the narrative pacing and emotional distance.
Give us an example of how he uses this distance.
So when Thucydides wants to provide a broad, sweeping historical summary, say describing the movement of an army across a region or setting the geographical stage, he relies heavily on the aorist tense.
The aorist tense.
Right. The aorist provides what linguists call a perfective view. It looks at an action as a complete, self-contained whole, viewed from the outside.
So it creates a sense of detachment. You are safe. You are just reading a history book.
Exactly. It is remote, it is analytical. But when the narrative arrives at the climax, when the Athenian and Syracusan triremes are violently ramming into each other in the claustrophobia of the great harbor Thucydides, abruptly shifts gears.
He drops the aorist.
Yes, and he drops it and suddenly floods the text with the imperfect and present tenses.
And what psychological effect does that have on someone reading the Greek?
It creates an imperfective aspect. It shatters that comfortable remote detachment. The imperfective aspect forces you to view the action from the inside as an ongoing, continuous, unfolding process.
You are no longer looking at the battle from a mountaintop.
Right. Thucydides has grabbed you by the collar and dragged you down onto the deck of a sinking ship. You hear the wood splintering, you hear the screams of the rowers drowning below deck, you feel the panic because the action is happening now around you and it isn't resolved.
It is exactly like the techniques used by a brilliant movie director. Think about it. The aorist tense is the wide, sweeping drone shot. The camera is 500 feet in the air. You see the blue water, you see the two fleets lining up in perfect geometric formations.
It is majestic and clean.
Right. But the moment the fleets collide, the director switches to a shaky, handheld GoPro camera attached to a soldier's helmet. That is the imperfect tense.
The lens gets splashed with blood and seawater.
Yeah. The horizon is tilting wildly. The sound design becomes a wall of chaotic noise. And the source notes that Thucydides also weaves in the future tense strategically to build this terrible sense anticipation.
He lets the reader know that the doom hanging over these men is inescapable.
And all of these linguistic shifts serve a broader structural technique that the source identifies as theme-reme progression.
Right, theme reme. In linguistics, the theme is your starting point, the known information that sets the context. The reme is the new information, the direction the sentence or the narrative is moving toward. The source argues that Thucydides tracks the spiritual and emotional trajectory of the entire war by shifting the macro-level theme and reme of books 6 and 7.
Let's trace that progression. Where does the narrative begin? What is the starting theme?
The starting theme is Athenian eros. The text begins dominated by the irrational, passionate desire of the Athenian populace to conquer, to acquire, to expand. That driving lust is the engine of the early narrative.
But as the reality of Sicily begins to set in, the focus, the reme, shifts violently.
The engine stalls.
Precisely. The text moves away from Athenian ambition and begins to focus intensely on the stubborn, unyielding resilience of Syracuse, especially after the Spartan general Gylippus takes command.
And by the time we reach the end of Book 7, the progression terminates in an entirely new reality. Total suffocating Athenian despair.
The language itself, at a structural level, mirrors the trajectory of hubris. It starts with arrogant desire, meets immovable resistance, and ends in utter destruction.
It's brilliantly constructed.
But seeing how intentionally Thucydides crafted this raises a vital question about his motives. I mean, does this intense focus on human eros, on this lustful ambition, suggest that Thucydides viewed the Sicilian disaster primarily as a profound moral and spiritual failing of his people? Or was he just a frustrated general pointing out really bad military strategy?
Well, Thucydides would argue that you cannot separate the two. To him, terrible military strategy is the inevitable offspring of moral decay.
Because they're linked.
Exactly. When a society is governed by eros, by irrational passion, greed, and the insatiable desire for more, they fundamentally lose the capacity for rational, prudent statecraft. Their moral compass shatters, and their strategic compass immediately follows.
And to prove that this wasn't just a unique, isolated mistake, but part of a cyclical human disease, Thucydides weaves echoes of older, mythic stories of overreach directly into his history.
Right, the intertextual connections in this source are where the literary brilliance of the text really shines. Thucydides is not writing in a vacuum. He knows his audience has been raised on the epic poetry of the Greek world.
The source reveals that Thucydides is intentionally echoing Homer. He essentially structures the entire Sicilian expedition as an inverted Odyssey.
It is a masterful, dark subversion of the most famous story in Greek culture. In Homer's Odyssey, the hero, Odysseus, has survived a massive war and is desperately journeying home.
Right, traveling from east to west.
Yeah, facing terrifying monsters and navigating strange, hostile lands just to return to his family. Thucydides flips the script entirely. Here, an entire empire is journeying outward, away from home, traveling west as the unprovoked aggressor.
And instead of finding glory and wealth, they sail directly into a landscape that acts exactly like the mythical, destructive monsters of the Odyssey.
Yes, Sicily becomes the land of the Cyclops, or the cannibalistic Laestrygonians. It is a hostile alien environment that simply swallows the Athenians whole. The hunters sail across the sea only to realize they are the prey.
That is such a chilling realization. And the source also points out that the narrative structure mirrors the tragic reversal of fortune we see in the Iliad. But the historical parallel that is perhaps the most stinging is the connection to Herodotus and the Persian Wars.
Oh, this part is fascinating.
It genuinely gave me chills. Just a generation or two before the Sicilian expedition, Athens was the ultimate underdog. During the Persian Wars, they were the heroic, scrappy democracy that stood up to the tyrannical, massive, overreaching empire of Xerxes.
Right, they defeated the Persian armada at Salamis against impossible odds.
But now, in 415 BC...
Now, Thucydides forces Athens to look in the mirror and realize they have become the monster they once defeated. By launching this massive, unprovoked armada to conquer a distant land out of sheer greed, Athens has become the new Persia.
They are the overreaching, imperial aggressor. They have adopted the exact same hubris that brought down Xerxes. But hold on, I want to look at the reality of what Thucydides is doing here. He is an Athenian citizen. He is publishing a history that essentially calls his own beloved city the new Cyclops, the new Persian Empire. Isn't he taking a massive personal risk by writing this?
It's a huge risk.
I mean, we just talked about how the assembly condemned Alcibiades to death based on rumors about some broken statues. How do we know this text isn't just the bitter, sour grapes of an exiled general settling scores with the politicians who ruined his career?
Well, it's a fair question, and historians constantly debate Thucydides' biases. It is true he was writing from a place of exile, having been blamed for failing to defend the city of Amphipolis earlier in the war.
So he had an axe to grind.
Maybe, but that exile is actually what gave him the unique vantage point to write this history. He was removed from the toxic echo chamber politics of the Athenian assembly. He had the physical and intellectual distance and access to both Athenian and Spartan sources to see the geopolitical truth clearly.
He wasn't just settling scores, he was trying to leave a possession for all time, a warning to future generations about the pathology of power.
Yes, and it is precisely that deep moral critique of hubris that sets the perfect stage for the theological pivot in our source document.
Right, and this is where we get to the core mission of our deep dive today. The author of our source takes this secular political critique of power and uses it as a bridge to explore a biblical critique of worldly power.
This is where the multidisciplinary nature of the source really pays off. Now, the author acknowledges up front that there is no direct biblical engagement with Thucydides. He was a pagan Greek writing centuries before the New Testament, and he wasn't reading the Hebrew prophets.
But the thematic parallels are astonishingly rich. The Athenian disaster serves as a perfect historical proof of concept for the Old Testament warnings against imperial hubris.
Exactly. When you read the prophets, when you read Isaiah condemning the arrogance of Assyria or warning about the inevitable catastrophic fall of Babylon, you see the exact same spiritual mechanics at play that destroyed Athens.
The prophets constantly warn that when an empire relies entirely on its own strength, when it boasts in its wealth and its military machinery, it is setting itself up for divine judgment.
In the ancient Near East and throughout the Old Testament, we see this recurring motif of Babel. The story of the Tower of Babel is fundamentally about the hubris of humanity trying to build a name for themselves.
Right, trying to engineer their way up to the heavens through their own collective effort, only to have their plans shattered and confused by God.
And the author of our source looks at the Sicilian expedition and says, basically, Athens launching 134 triremes to conquer the West is a naval Tower of Babel. It was the same spiritual disease, just wearing different armor.
But the source is careful to draw a stark contrast between the fundamental worldview of the Greek text and the biblical worldview. Because while Thucydides was brilliant at diagnosing human flaws, he did not believe in the God of Israel. His universe operated on entirely different roles.
Very different roles. In Thucydides' worldview, history is driven by two immense forces, human agency and Taish.
Taishe, which translates roughly to fortune, blind chance, or randomness.
Right. The Athenians essentially believed that if their human agency was strong enough, if they built enough ships and amassed enough silver, they could bend Taish to their will. They could insulate themselves from chance.
But as Thucydides shows, they were ultimately at the mercy of the random chaos of the universe. A sudden storm, lunar eclipse, an unpredictable opponent chance ruined them.
And contrast that with the biblical worldview. In the Old Testament, the driving force of history is not blind chance. It is divine providence.
Exactly. The biblical authors replace the terrifying randomness of Taish with the purposeful, though often mysterious, sovereignty of God. God raises up empires, and God brings them down.
And this highlights the massive gulf between covenantal humility and imperial pride. If you look at the kings of Israel and Judah, God explicitly warns them against multiplying horses and chariots.
They are judged not by the size of their standing army, but by their faithfulness to the covenant. Athens put their entire faith in their chariots of the sea, and they were destroyed.
The source also brings in the New Testament here, specifically looking at the book of James. James writes powerfully about the difference between earthly wisdom and heavenly wisdom.
He says that earthly wisdom is driven by bitter envy and selfish ambition, and that it inevitably leads to disorder and every vile practice.
When Alcibiades was speaking to the assembly, he was offering what looked like supreme, strategic earthly wisdom. But at its core, it was just selfish ambition masked as statecraft.
And consider the psychological burden of living in a universe governed only by Taish and human agency. If you believe that your security, your wealth, and your legacy depend entirely on your own ability to control a chaotic world, you become frantic.
You become ruthlessly ambitious because you are terrified of losing what you have. You are constantly trying to secure your position against the randomness of life.
And ultimately, you fall into despair when the wheel of fortune inevitably turns against you, as it did for Athens. But the Christian worldview, the source argues, replaces the exhausting anxiety of type with the peace of providence.
It is the difference between building on a rock versus building on the sand.
Yeah, you can build a massive, opulent house on the sand. You can use the most expensive marble, hire the best architects, and have an army of guards protecting it. That is Athens relying on their triremes and their treasury.
Right.
But the moment the storm of reality hits, the moment the unpredictable wind of Tyche blows, the entire structure collapses because there is no bedrock beneath it.
And the source asks a really compelling question here. How does seeing this dramatic failure of worldly wisdom help a Christian listeners spot similar worldly wisdom in their own era?
Which brings us to the patristic reception of these histories. The early church fathers, particularly St. Augustine, engaged deeply with the themes found in writers like Thucydides.
They did. Augustine's monumental work, City of God, serves as the perfect bridge between classical history and Christian theology.
And to understand Augustine's perspective, you have to understand the crisis of his own moment. Augustine was writing in the early 5th century AD. In the year 410, the unthinkable happened. The city of Rome was sacked by the Visigoths.
Rome, the eternal city, the invincible superpower that had brought order to the world, was burning. It was an existential shock to the Roman psyche.
And the pagan elite immediately began pointing fingers at the Christians. They argued, Rome is falling because we abandoned the old gods. We stopped sacrificing to Jupiter, and now we are being punished.
So Augustine has to write a defense. And he basically points back to histories like the Sicilian expedition and says, look at Athens. They worshiped the old gods perfectly. They poured out golden libations to Hermes and Athena. Right before they launched their fleet, they had all the military power in the world, and they still destroyed themselves from the inside out.
Augustine used the brutal histories written by men like Thucydides to establish a realistic anthropology, a true, unvarnished picture of human brokenness.
Right. While the scriptures were the ultimate authority for Augustine, he utilized secular history to prove his point to a secular audience. He wanted to demonstrate the ultimate futility of what he called the earthly city.
For Augustine, the glory of Athens, just like the glory of Rome, was always a mirage. It was inherently unstable because the earthly city is built entirely on the love of self.
It is driven by libido dominandi, the lust for domination. It is the exact same eros that Thucydides identified.
So, by pointing out that the earthly city is always doomed to collapse under the weight of its own arrogance, the Church Fathers provided this incredibly sharp, beautiful contrast to the eternal, unshakable hope of the heavenly city.
The city built not on the love of self, but on the love of God.
Exactly. And the source points out that this realistic, almost pessimistic view of earthly empires heavily influenced the development of Christian ethical frameworks, like the just war tradition.
When you strip away the romantic mythology of conquest, when you actually read Thucydides and see the horrific reality of tens of thousands of men starving to death in rock quarries because of a politician's ego, you can no longer view war as a glorious game or a noble pursuit.
It becomes, at best, a tragic necessity in a broken world, something that must be governed by strict moral limits. It taught the early church to place their trust in God's providence rather than in military maneuvering or political supremacy.
But I know a lot of people struggle with this exact theology. Let me play devil's advocate for a second.
Okay, go for it.
If the earthly city is fundamentally corrupt and doomed to fail like Athens did, if all human empires are just building castles on the sand, doesn't that breed a kind of cynical withdrawal?
Isn't there a risk that Christians become fatalistic?
Yeah. You might look at the world and say, well, the politics are corrupt, the empires are going to burn anyway, so why should I bother participating in society? Why try to fix the burning building?
That is a very common misinterpretation of Augustine's two cities framework, but Augustine himself would fiercely argue against that kind of fatalistic withdrawal, and so does the author of our source document.
Recognizing the inherent flaws and ultimate temporality of the earthly city is not a call to apathy. It is a call to properly order your loves.
Right. Explain what ordering your loves looks like practically for you and me.
It means you still work for the good of the earthly city. You still seek justice, you still build hospitals, you still participate in government, and you try to enact good policies.
But you do all of those things without the idolatrous illusion that you are building heaven on earth.
Exactly. You engage in the world without the frantic, desperate hubris of Alcibiades, because your ultimate hope, your core identity, is not tied to the success or failure of the earthly city. You can serve the city without worshiping it.
Which brings us to the culmination of the author's analysis. How does studying an ancient military disaster practically equip the Christian life today? How does it deepen a listener's faith?
The source synthesizes this into a framework of affirmation and critique. Let's start with affirmation.
Okay.
As Christians, we can read a pagan historian like Thucydides and affirm that his brutally realistic assessment of human nature is entirely accurate. His depiction of unchecked ambition, the madness of crowds, and the corrupting nature of power perfectly aligns with the biblical realism about sin.
The prophet Jeremiah tells us that the human heart is deceitful above all things. And Thucydides provides a terrifying historical case study that proves it. He holds up a mirror to the darkness of the human heart.
But then there is the critique. Where does Thucydides fall short?
Right. What's missing?
The critique is that Thucydides only has half the equation. He lacks the revelation of redemption. He's a brilliant diagnostician. He can look at the Athenian Empire and tell you exactly what spiritual disease is killing them. But he has absolutely no cure to offer.
His universe only has Tyche, the blind, crushing wheel of fortune.
As Christians, we read this history and we say, yes, that is the inescapable tragedy of humanity left entirely to its own devices. But praise God, the story doesn't end there. There is grace.
And I think the practical application here is profound because, let's be honest, none of us listening to this are standing in an assembly tomorrow voting on whether to send 134 warships to conquer Sicily.
Probably not, no.
The scale is different. But the mechanisms of the human heart haven't changed a bit since 415 BC. The source argues that we read these texts to foster profound humility and spiritual prudence in our own lives.
We learn to spot the vulnerabilities in our own institutions. We see how easily a crowd can be whipped into a frenzy by a charismatic leader who feeds their desires, and we learn to be wary of that kind of rhetoric in our own political and social spheres.
But more importantly, we have to discern those same vulnerabilities in our own hearts. The source cautions us against personal empire building.
Yeah, this is key. You might not be an Athenian general, but you might be building a ruthless little empire in your career, climbing the corporate ladder at the expense of your family's well-being and your own integrity.
You might be building an empire in your local church, trying to amass personal influence and power rather than humbly serving the flock. You might be doing it in your social circle, constantly maneuvering for status.
Whenever we prioritize our own glory, our own expansion, and our own desires over obedience to God and love for our neighbor, we are essentially launching our own private Sicilian expedition.
We are letting arrows take the wheel. And the warning of history, echoing through the pages of Thucydides and amplified by Scripture, is that building your life on that kind of selfish ambition always ends in disaster.
We all have our own Sicilies. We all have these distant shores, these shiny, tantalizing goals that we are convinced will finally bring us ultimate wealth, untouchable status, or perfect security if we can just conquer them.
We think, if I just get that promotion, if I just hit that financial milestone, if I just secure this specific relationship, then I'll finally be safe from the chaos of the world.
But the gospel flips that entire narrative upside down.
Yeah.
The gospel tells us that we don't need to frantically conquer Sicily because Christ has already conquered death.
We already have the kingdom. We don't have to secure our own ultimate safety through our own exhausting efforts because our lives are hidden in Christ.
And that realization is where the profound shift in our desires happens. By looking closely at the utter emptiness, the anxiety, and the ultimate destruction of pagan power politics, Christians are inspired to love Christ more deeply.
We look at the vanity of Alcibiades and the terror of Nicias, and then we look at Jesus. We marvel at the beauty of a king who chose to conquer, not through a fleet of triremes, but by enduring a cross.
A king who, instead of slaughtering his enemies in a harbor to secure his own power, laid down his own life to redeem them.
It is a complete inversion of how the world understands power and victory. Studying a text like this doesn't just make you historically literate. It actually sharpens your spiritual discernment.
It strips away the illusion that earthly success will save us, and it anchors our ultimate hope where it belongs. Not in human agency, not in the shifting, unpredictable winds of fortune, but in the unshakable promises of God.
It serves as a constant historical reminder that the kingdom of God advances not by the sword, not by political maneuvering, and not by sheer force of will, but by the Spirit.
Grasping that truth is profoundly liberating. It frees you from the exhausting anxiety of feeling like you have to be the master of your own universe. You can step off the treadmill of empire building.
What an incredible, sweeping journey we have taken today. We started by looking at the blank spaces on old maps, and then we launched from the glittering harbor of Athens with a massive fleet built entirely on a foundation of pride and willful ignorance.
We watched the tragic, agonizing unraveling of political leadership. We felt the claustrophobic panic of the naval battles through the brilliant linguistic manipulation of the ancient Greek text.
We saw the ghosts of older empires warning Athens against the hubris of overreach. And ultimately, following the path laid out by our source, we arrived at the profound peace of biblical providence.
We've seen how examining the ruins of earthly ambition can actually point us directly toward the unshakable hope of Christ.
It has been a truly rich and layered discussion, and I want to leave you, the listener, with one final, provocative thought to mull over as you go about the rest of your day.
When Thucydides stood back and looked at the ruins of the Athenian fleet, the sunken ships and the starving men, he saw only the tragic, random wheel of fortune crushing human ambition. He saw a meaningless universe.
But as a Christian, when you look at the apparent chaos of human history, or even when you face the sudden, unexpected reversals and failures in your own personal life, can you trace the hand of a sovereign God?
A God who is constantly, quietly, and mercifully disarming our pride, allowing our little empires to fall, simply to invite us into a kingdom that cannot be shaken.
That is the perfect question to leave hanging in the air. Keep seeking out knowledge, stay curious, and keep looking for the deeper connections in the history you read and the lives you live. Until next time.